Welcome to Chaos Orchestra episode number 10, The Future of Enterprise IT. We live in a world where Google is able to understand the context of our questions and find sources with the right results from billions within milliseconds. Where Facebook has more accurate cognitive models of individuals and a society than social science departments of the best universities in the world, and is thus able to present us a very tailored perspective on the world. Where Amazon knows our needs and desires better than most of our friends and is able to adjust recommendations to us every day. And like in a parallel world, there are these companies from the life science and healthcare, automotive industry, financial industry that kind of accepted the impossibilities to integrate all data, to make all of the company's knowledge transparent, accessible, and to be able to build sustainable and flexible solutions rather than an application for each problem. Things that sometimes scare us how easy they are for the big five and how much knowledge they're actually able to monetize. Our today's guest is Sean Martin, co-founder and CTO of Cambridge Semantics. With the help of Sean, I hope to understand why, despite knowledge graph technologies, natural language processing, and machine learning algorithms being more accessible than ever to the outside world, companies are still struggling so much in enabling collective intelligence. And what he thinks about how far we are from this Google-like surge within enterprises over all data, structured and unstructured.
There are actually quite a few reasons, but they boil down to a question of focus and having the resources to attack the problem. Integrating data at scale is at any scale really is generally very, very expensive because it's fiddly and it takes a lot of attention to detail. So you need people with the right skills, but it's also very exacting. It's very easy to get it wrong and to make mistakes. And applying sort of more advanced techniques in search and machine learning and so on also takes enormous amounts of skills. And all of that is extremely costly. So if you've got a focused business like Google, which its job is to produce a very good search result when somebody enters something, or Facebook, which is really attempting to create a massive amount of engagement, have you spend as much time as possible on their system because they're making money in both cases out of advertising. That they are able to bring to bear a huge amount of resource in terms of buying the best skills and paying for enormous amounts of R&D and doing an awful lot of testing at enormous volumes too. So they're attacking a problem that has a very large number of ways of testing it. So the people, many millions of people using their services, if not billions. That gives them a way to hone what they're doing in a way that you just don't get those kind of scales. And so when you look at what enterprise is doing, they can truly only afford a very small fraction of that kind of investment for their problems. And they're not just tackling one problem, they've got many, dozens and dozens and dozens of problems that they need through to pursue their business, which often isn't, the core business of Google is to deliver a good search, which has a lot of context. But if I'm making a motor vehicle or a chemical or, a drug, for example, that's what my business is, and everything else is sort of ancillary to that. So it's, and the investment tends to follow where the products are, even if it was possible to put in the kind of resources that a Facebook or Google or one of the others you mentioned can put in. So really, for me, the question is, how does one attack this? Knowing that enterprises have a limited, even the very, very profitable enterprises still are limited in what they can do in terms of hiring of people to do this particular job, which again isn't necessarily right in the core of their business, but it's an add to it. And so what can we do, given what they want to do, to help them essentially bring down the cost of data integrations to a point where they can do more and more of them than they can at the moment. Right now, they're really very limited. Only the most valuable problems get addressed. The ones that have business cases that either are saving them money because they're not getting fines if you're in the banking industry, you know, the massive fines if you infringe regulatory stuff. Same in the pharmaceutical industry. So either they're saving money and keeping themselves out of legal trouble, or it's something that can bring down costs, or in some cases, maybe it's a new business which is data driven, and businesses are starting to get into that, where there's actually a profit motive. But essentially, there's a business case that has to be pretty valuable for them to want to decide, out of all the data integration problems that they could potentially tackle that might be useful, which ones really in the end get done. And then there's a second problem, which is there's this extremely high rate of failure in enterprises. A Google or Facebook and so on have employed legions of PhDs, quite literally, who are the people at those academic institutes, or at least were there a year or two ago. They were the leading sort of researchers on, say, machine learning or this or that or the next thing. And they hire these guys, and the problems they give them are often not that hard, and not surprisingly, they hit it out of the park all the time. Simply because you're applying, very clever people to the problem, and giving them sufficient resources to tackle them. And I guess there's plenty of room for failure within the margins of the amount of money those businesses are able to bring in through advertising. This is not the case with most enterprises. Now, I've read the statistics somewhere, and I have no particular reason to doubt it. I don't know if it's really as high as this or not, but it's still high. Apparently 50% of data warehousing initiatives fail for one reason or another, which is, and there's a whole lot of reasons why they can go wrong. But in general, it's a question of matching two elements. One is the people part of the problem, having the right skills and the right discipline and the right processes and so on. And then there's the technology, the choice of technology. And these two things have to go together and work perfectly to avoid a failure, and more than that, a failure over time. Because in general, the systems people are setting up are need to be long-lived if you're putting in significant investments in them. So anyway, I think the problem really is that data integration is very hard. It is very exacting. And it takes a lot of resources to bring to bear on it. The technology, sort of the most recent technology, is relatively expensive to deliver, and it's always been quite expensive to deliver data integration. And these other big companies are just highly focused and get massive rewards from getting it right. And it's true that, and also it's partly that they've picked their battles, right? Is another thing, right? If the reason Amazon knows more about us than our friends is because I don't spend my time telling my friends about that I want this or I want that, I want the next thing. But do I add them to my list in Amazon? Yes, I do. I'm giving them the information. It's, whereas I very little of that is probably shared with anybody else in my life, and I'm sure that's a common pattern. Similarly, Facebook is recording all of your interactions with everybody else. You're actually giving them that information in a nice, easy way to digest it. They pick the interface. They can capture it in a way that's very clean to them. And they got plenty of time to get it right. Google's interesting in that I think they've always got a human in front of the screen who's responding to what's searched for. So even if they don't get the context of what I'm asking right, you said, why do they always get it right with context? They've actually got me sitting there ready to adjust my search if I didn't like what the response is, if they didn't interpret it correctly. And sometimes they'll give you 2 or 3 choices. If you put in an address, you may see some search results, you may see a little map thing. You've got to kind of take the next action and help them kind of narrow that context down. So, but in every case, they've picked the battlefield, and they've thrown enormous resources at the problems, and they're being very successful doing so. I think if any business could attack the problem that they choose with the same kind of resources, they'd have the same kind of success. So, but that's not viable. There just aren't those kind of resources. There aren't those kind of skills available as widely. And so the question for me is, how do we try and level the playing field as best we can? So long answer, and there's many pieces to unpack within that. But and I don't even think I've covered it all. But it's really not a fair competition. That's what I would say. So
yeah, agreed. And still, in companies, I mean, you mentioned that there's really a lot of research resources backed all that, and I feel we're at a point in time where all these technologies became much more accessible, and you don't need to be a pioneer in this in order to be able to make maybe use of them, right?
Well, historically, the most successful data integration technology has been the data warehouse and various relational variants of that, right? And we're going back to the 70s, is when Cod was writing his papers and Larry Ellison was reading them and starting Oracle, and IBM ended up with DB2 and so on, and then we had a whole sort of multiple generations of data warehousing, the systems for putting gathering data up, ETL systems like Informatica. We had the cubes and the BI revolution and so on. So there's been successive generations that have built on that original relational base, and it has been very successful. However, it's also had a lot of issues over the years. You, as I said before, there's a fairly high failure rate when somehow the match of technology, maybe you didn't get the right system, or it wasn't scalable enough, or you didn't budget properly for it, or you just weren't able to secure the skills that you needed to design the models, or the discipline you needed to be able to do these processes day in, day out and do them cleanly. Whatever those combinations of things are that you had to get right, that technology base has still been, and that's sort of those many years worth of building on the ecosystem that started with relational technology has been the most successful to date, in just fact. But people are not that happy and comfortable with it because of all the expense and the difficulties associated with it. So they're constantly looking for easier ways to do things. And I think the whole big data revolution we had over the last sort of 15 years, I think in many ways that was a reaction against some of the constraints of the relational world. But the big data revolution really never delivered a better way of integrating data. And you see a return to people looking at relational and data warehousing if they ever went away. When we started Cambridge Semantics about 14 years ago, I remember being warned by people to not use the word, and in fact, I even heard it in conferences, not use the words data warehouse. They were a dirty word within enterprise. And if you were proposing a project which was a data warehouse, you'd have to call it something else. Otherwise, the business would jump at you. And so people tried to get into big data, and there were a bunch of vendors who tried to make that an alternative way of integrating data, where we went from schema on write to schema on read, and what we ended up with, not unpredictably, was the data swamps and the chaos and so on that followed. And not only that, those big data technologies were, for the most part, invented by actually some of those companies you mentioned at the head for a very specialized purpose. They were for log processing and not for generalized data integration, where you've got a lot of heterogeneous data that you're trying to tie together. The big data technologies, the Apache technologies, weren't great for pulling data together. They were good for aggregating a lot of data, but not really for pulling it together into a coherent whole. So anyway, what has also happened over the same period, and perhaps over the last 20 years, say from 2000, but even before, is people have been learning about graph technologies, and trying to overcome. Essentially, graph technology starts with a different kind of database to the the principles in which the relational are built. Um, and the problem has been to scale that technology to a point where it could deal with meaningful amounts of data, practical amounts of data. And not only that, but the database is just the bottom layer. It's where data is stored. You've still got to get data into this database, into a graph form. And then you need tools and middleware that understands data, which is no longer in a tabular form. So you've got, since the 1970s environment, all built around tabular representations, and big data was, for the most part, tabular, except for processing of text. But let's put that all to the side. But in the end, it was things like Hive and Hadoop and things were, for the most part, dealing with, an enterprise were dealing with tabular structures, where they were trying to avoid often licensing fees from some of the big vendors, but also just, it was fashionable and people wanted to kick the tires. So we've had tabular structures for most of our structured data since the 70s, whether it be the big data environments or the relational ones. But we haven't had, and we've had the software that understands how to drive those things also be built on tabular technologies and be relatively poor on metadata too. Metadata was always kept on the side and in spreadsheets or in metadata systems, but often there were practical limits to how much you could cram into a set of linked up tables. So the graph technologies have had to climb that whole build their whole ecosystem to essentially deliver the same kinds of things, but with graph, but starting with really no software that understood graph from the point of view of the database, the middleware, the user interface tools, the ETL tools that actually populate your graphs. All of that didn't really exist, and it was always second best. So not only were people trying to understand what graph was and how to use it, but they were always working with a mainly broken software or very limited software, and the thing didn't scale. And so there were a lot of problems with it, and there have been. And we didn't have middleware that was kind of graph aware and visualization that was graph aware, except in patches. Just occasionally you'd see something, but it would always be just a part of the problem, and you'd never see a comprehensive solution that tied all the pieces you need together in one coherent way, like you can assemble a stack on top of relational database today. It's pretty easy. You pick your database, you pick your middleware, you pick your BI tool, and they're all going to work together because they were designed to work together. That was not true of the graph world when we started looking at it, me and some colleagues and competitors. And we've essentially built our entire ecosystem since then. Right? We've essentially had to build every part of the stack since then. And really what has happened in the last few years is that stack has now reached and in some cases is going beyond what you can do with the traditional stack. But of course, at customers, you've got to make these two worlds coexist. It's because they've invested in this database or this BI tool, and they've got skills, and they've got users who understand those, and there's a lot of trust because they've been using them successfully for a long time. So the graph people have always got to figure out how to kind of retrofit themselves into this world. But the news, I think, of the last couple of years is it's getting there, right? Graphs can be scaled now. We see a number of companies who are building very big graphs. People are doing virtualization with graphs moderately successfully, probably as successfully as you can with relational technology. And the data scales are now beyond practical for the kinds of problems that the scale of problems that our customers are mostly seeing now. And the middleware, which essentially packages into it and codes into it a lot of best practices that were not there before, and users would, users more like developers and researchers would have to kind of invent those best practices and figure out what worked and go down a lot of blind alleys. All that experience has now been packaged into systems into platforms. And there are a number of platforms, graph platforms out there. And they are starting to make it, I mean, what middleware essentially does is it abstracts and makes easier to use that on which it is sitting. And so we have now got good middleware and good tools for graph. We've got good ETL tools for graph. We've got good middleware for graph. We've got good BI tools for graph, and we've got good connectors to the more traditional world. And so now finally we're getting to the point where graph can actually come into its own and play on a more level playing field, and I believe delivers far more value as it continues to get improved. Simply the reason people invested in graph is they saw the potential for data integration of complex data, heterogeneous data. That would be tabular data and sort of semi-structured data, like so tabular data I consider to be simple data, semi-structured data like XML and maybe what you got in Parquet and JSON and those kind of systems, and then complex data, which is that which you extract from textual sources and video and audio and so on. And actually there's been a quiet revolution, or maybe even not so quiet revolution on that side too, because when we were first looking at integrating information extracted from text, we were essentially doing partnerships with companies that specialized in textual extractors, and they were each extractor was highly specialized, right? In the medical field, there were far more of them than in, say, in the manufacturing field, where people had and obviously the government had invested a lot for various reasons in extracting data out of text. So you found very specialized tools that were either statistically based or dictionaries or whatever their secret source was. But in the last 10 years, we've now seen machine learning being applied very successfully and potentially much more successfully to that. So it can be done by people who've got data science training. You don't need a specialist vendor anymore to make some highly specialized extractor like you would have 10 years ago. 10 years ago, you relied on vendors to build them, and there being enough of a market there for those things to emerge. Now you can go ahead and just use many of the machine learning frameworks to train your own models to extract whatever you want. So the ability to pull signal out of complex data has enormously improved over the last 10 years. But again, it's not something you get for free. You've got to invest in it. You've got to pay a couple of data scientists or a team to build that, and you've got to be ready to invest in the iterations needed to get it together. But the point is, you can now build that. And so from our point of view, as someone who consumes that kind of data, it's just getting better and better, because you've got the ability to actually pull signal out of text and bring it out in a coherent way that we can then combine it with those other forms of less complex data. Makes us increasingly relevant. And of course, perhaps your listeners don't know about this, but from my point of view, graph structures, particularly ones that are schemaless, where they can be grown, the model, we use OWL as a modeling language, but any system where you can essentially grow the schema dynamically as data enters it. And when I say grow, either grow the schema or use schemaless, and essentially you're just modeling the data with more data. Those systems are absolutely perfect for pulling data out of unstructured sources where you really don't know what kinds of things you're going to find in there. You're constantly discovering new entity types, and you've got to end up with a model that can expand to accept those new entity types with their attributes and so on. And so the form of knowledge graph that our company uses is exactly very good for that, and that has also been, I think, true of some of the competition. So graph definitely is now showing promise in terms of reducing the skills you need to actually start adopting it, and that means reducing the costs and the time and so on and the risk, and it's increasingly capable of doing addressing more and more of the problems, the practical problems you have, because it can address the scale that you previously were only able to tackle with, you know, relational databases, well-tuned and so on. You're now able to tackle the same kinds of problems. So I would say the landscape is changing in the favor of the knowledge graph as people are realizing that it's possible, and that there's a lot of tools to help them, that they're going to get results with less risk and more quickly than they previously could. And that the solutions they're going to be able to deliver are ones they, in many cases, would not be able to deliver any other way, and they would just not have had an approach to delivering them. So it's actually a pretty exciting time at the moment as we watch this technology start to you know, flow out into the market. Obviously, I would still say it's an early adopter market. You have to be knowledge graph interested. But for those that are, the cost of getting into it is dropping through the, you know, it's just constantly dropping. Every year it just gets cheaper and cheaper to do, and I think that's going to continue. So yeah, another long answer for you there.
Yeah, and I think one of the most critical requirements is actually being able to answer questions that you were not prepared to answer. So not building systems that are tailored to one specific use case, but having this kind of flexibility that allows you to build sustainable and long-term systems. But one thing that you mentioned is that these companies that really exploit graph technologies, like the Big Five, for example, they're always playing in an area with massive investments and massive rewards, right? So how do enterprises deal with that if it's not the core of their business model to sell this knowledge? And how do they deal with this late break-even points?
Well, I think first of all, I agree with you. I think that one of the I think there are different dimensions to this. One is I firmly believe that the data integration is a killer app for graph. Right now that we've scaled graph up, data integration is a killer app for that, and it's more than that. It's the nature of the data integration that makes it so interesting, which kind of goes to the second thing you said, which is people need questions to be answered, right? And one of the shortcomings of the previous generation of data integration, the data warehouse relational approach, is you kind of had to know the questions you wanted to ask up front, so you could design a system specifically about delivering the answers, and that was difficult unless you were doing something, you know, which was very obvious. But business moves very quickly, and those technologies would often take a long time to implement. And by the time you had it working, the business had often moved on or had given up on getting particular questions to be answered, or they weren't relevant anymore. And so one of the big complaints about the previous warehouse style technologies and ilk is that it was too slow, too inflexible, and really you just could not. If you had a second order question, one that you hadn't quite anticipated, maybe based on a question that you had anticipated that was being answered by the system because it was designed to do so, it had a schema, it had the data, it had everything you needed, you kind of fell off the, you know, you just had a dead stop there until the system could be adjusted, you know, through some new version. And we had banks that were adjusting their systems, you know, once every 6 months you'd get a new release of the warehouse. You know, it just didn't work. So how do you get your questions answered much more quickly? And if you think about that previous paradigm, it was really about, okay, I know what questions people want to ask. I'm now going to prepare the schema and figure out what data they need and put that data into that schema, and now you can answer those questions, run reports, run BI. And the BI revolution was, if you like, a way to begin to address the problem of the inflexibility, because you can now essentially get an extract and then use a much more agile tool, you know, a Spotfire or Tableau or ClickView, or, you know, one of these tools could at least give you a way of allowing end users to answer the questions, but they're always doing it on a narrower extract of data coming from somewhere upstream. And quite often your question you'd fall off the edge of what data you'd actually extracted. They were not very good at complex data where you've got lots of different types of things and relationships to each other. They tended to be, again, more tabular. But at least it gave you the beginnings of an answer to how to make this more flexible. So that was kind of where the BI revolution came from. What graph promises is really it turns the paradigm a little bit on its head, because what we're able to do there is we don't think so much about what questions do you want to answer. I mean, you do in broad strokes, because we're gonna answer questions about drugs or this or that or the next thing. You have to know your domain of questions. But because graph technology is so flexible in terms of being able to ingest data of really any kind of schema and model, you just ingest it all, as opposed to thinking very carefully in advance which questions I'm going to answer. Okay, which data do I need to do? And then you go through the painful process of setting up the ETL programs or whatever your mechanism is for populating your database. All that was very expensive and painful. Whereas now we just say, hey, we need all this data related to these things which we're going to be answering questions about, and we load it all up and we figure out how to knit it together. And unlike in relational, where you're starting to worry about keys and joins, and you've got 3 levels of models, you've got your physical model and logical models, etc. All of that there was kind of painstakingly knitted together, where any change would be an expensive breaking thing to have to fix. And the applications, of course, were the SQL queries against that data were also brittle. Anytime you wanted to add in more data, for example, if you were missing something. We don't have that problem with knowledge graphs, because what we do is we simply map all the available data up into a graph, and we build a comprehensive knowledge graph of everything in the domain. And then the questions you can ask are kind of the thing you do after you've got that all working. And we've built tools to allow you to formulate those questions where they will traverse the data in any direction to be able to look at even very complex combinations of things. So, I mean, I remember when we first saw this starting to emerge, when the technology first started working, it was the domain was in life sciences. They were an early user of knowledge graphs, and they were looking at systems to do something which was very important to them, very expensive, had huge implications for costs. So it's one of the areas they were prepared to invest in, and they were interested in trial site selection, where you're essentially trying to decide where in the world are you going to run your clinical trial. And there are many dimensions to this. What's the drug? Where is the population of people who have this problem? Can I find medically qualified people who know this disease, maybe, who know how to administer this? Drugs are administered in different ways. Have got people qualified to do that? Are my competitors in the same place? What other trials are being run that may mean that I can't get a population together to do my trial? Many dimensions of things. And the way people were doing it previously was, painstakingly looking at each element of that separately. Whereas we were able to say, okay, well, let's just bring all of the data that concerns us into one place. And now you just start asking your questions and adding as many dimensions as you need to filter them. We'll add those as we go, and we can kind of spin the question on a dime and change the question. But because the data is already there, we haven't got this long lag. And if you've got somebody who knows what they're doing sitting in front of the screen and who knows the domain, they're very quickly able to direct their questions in. And if they then find they're missing some data, it's with knowledge graphs, it's not this huge hike and a hugely disruptive thing where everything's going to break to bring in some additional data. You're simply attaching it into the graph. You find a place where the new data conceptually links through some relationship to the data that you've already got. Nothing that you've already got in terms of reporting breaks, but now you've got this extra dimension you can bring into your reporting if you want it. And so answering the questions has become much easier. And there's another benefit of the approach, which is that once you've got data into this form, often it'll answer adjacent questions and adjacent solutions. So a second solution or a third solution can simply be more data coming into the graph to answer more questions in adjacent problems. So you get this huge sort of reusability of data once you've established a knowledge graph with your data. And the reason why this is important is it tackles a couple of those problems I brought up earlier, which is cost and skills, right? You know, if your skilled people are able to do more quickly and deliver more, we call them data products, more quickly. A data product is kind of some data where you've done the work to pull it together and clean it up and essentially, you know, the time and skills that humans put in to get data together and get it coherent is it's expensive. It's one of the barriers. If you have to start every project again, it's an expense, and there's only a limited number you can do. But if you can make the data products much more quickly, because you're getting more reusability out of the sources of data, and you're not having to redo large amounts of work, which tends to be the case if you're lifting up all the data, right? You're not just picking and choosing a little bit here and a little bit there to answer questions. You're taking all the data and you clean it kind of en masse, and now it's reusable for many different data products. So the product essentially is the valuable thing that an IT business group will deliver to the business. That is a combination of data that reads on a solution that has value to the business. So how do we increase the number of data products you can deliver reliably and repeatedly? So these are really how we're starting to think about this, and how, for people who want to get started, the promise of being able to do that very quickly, I think, is what is exciting people currently. It's the technologies that I mentioned earlier, which have all come together now, that are now maturing enough. They are available to start to build out a data fabric, or a knowledge graph built on, a data fabric built on knowledge graphs that knits data together in a coherent way that makes additional data products more interesting. We're starting to see this now play out in our customers. Instead of addressing a onesies and twosies solutions, which is where we started, we're now starting to see the initial use case get started, and may often just be a matter of weeks before you can actually start to see how this is going to work and get value. It's quite common, given the approach doesn't require a massive 6-month schema design exercise or model, relational ER diagrams and all that stuff. Instead, you can get started in weeks, lift up the data you've got, knit it together as quickly as you can, and then start to deliver data products, which are essentially queries in any direction against that data. And if you're missing data for a second project or a third project, just add that data in, and now it's reusable. So I think we're changing the face of data integration. I think it's early days. I think it's early adopters at these customers, but it's the early adopters who see the promise of some disadvantage, some advantage that they can gain by embracing a new technology. And it's very typical in product adoption that the people who see it first are those who are ready to take a risk because they're looking for some disproportionate advantage. And those are the people that we're dealing with. But there's enough to keep us plenty busy at the moment, and some very big organizations making some very big bets now. So I think that's where we stand.
Can you paint a mental picture of these future IT architecture that would enable all these things, and how do knowledge graphs fit into the existing landscape?
Well, as with any business or any organization you deal with, has a spectrum and a risk tolerance and so on, and they have an existing landscape of what they've invested in already, both skills and systems and licenses and so on. So we're coming in from the outside and looking at that, and we're looking for what is the most rational entry point into a business like that. And generally it's not a good idea to go in somewhere and say, we're going to throw out everything you've done before. Your mainframes can go. We don't need this. This technology is much better. To start with, it's too, people aren't ready. They want to learn. Plus, they've got all this investment and they've got a business to run. And this generally for most people is not their first order of concern. So for us, the most reasonable place to start is essentially positioning the knowledge graph as an overlay technology, which can sit on top of whatever you've got already and essentially knit the data that comes from all those different sort of siloed systems into a coherent, connected up graph that you can now create data products out of. And that seems to be working very well because it's low risk. If it doesn't work out, in the grand scheme, it didn't break anything that was there. Nothing needed to be replaced. I think in the much longer run, graph technology is likely to replace other systems and warehouses and so on. If you've got a graph database that is essentially a warehouse, an OLAP system, then there's no reason in the long run why that couldn't happen. But those systems tend to be run by the most conservative part of the business, and they're going to want to see a long track record of all of this working before they're ready to replace their the existing data warehouse technology with graph data warehouse technology. And what's more likely to happen, of course, is that the big data warehouse vendors are going to simply bring graph into their products and extend those products lives that way. So but in the short run, and we could be talking 10 years, I think the notion of the data fabric that essentially relies on knowledge graph technology is the most reasonable way to do this. It addresses these problems that people have integrating data and de-siloing data. We've had 10 years of being told data is the new oil, but the problem is that oil is it's like at the bottom of the Atlantic or the North Sea, or somewhere inaccessible up in Alaska. That's the equivalent of it. So to free it up requires some amount of investment, and it's as mentioned, it's expensive and tricky. So is this a technology that can start to free up all those data assets so that they can be turned into value for the business? And that positioning, I think, works where we're actually very quickly showing that here's, if you've got a use case that is valuable and where the silos are, then this knowledge graph can be positioned over the top of it. But it's important. We're heavily based on, as many of our competitors are, on open standards. Because what you really don't want to do is build a new silo, which is for large enterprises something they're constantly doing with data warehouses. We need a data warehouse to aggregate this data, and then 3 years later, that data warehouse has become its own silo. So, by using open technologies, we're hopefully building these aggregate views of data. Sometimes, if we use virtualization, not even moving the data, and at the same time making very sure using standards that the data is neutral to vendors and is future proof. In 10 years time, the application may have gone, but the data will still be there and still be readable and understandable simply because of the standards, the open data standards we're using.
So can you explain the term GoLab? Because I feel like there's something that shifted in the recent years that made the semantic technology stack way more mature, and maybe if you put yourself in the shoes of a strategic IT executive or a CIO, lowered the risk of implementing semantic technologies. So what exactly changed in the last years?
So GoLab became viable is really the big change, and that was led by Barry Zane, who, of data warehouse fame. He was one of the leading technical guys behind Netezza. He founded Parexel, which happens to be the code base on which Amazon Redshift is built to. Both of those are relational warehouse systems. And by OLAP, I mean online analytic processing, OLAP. GoLab is graph online analytic processing. In other words, a data warehouse, but built as a graph. And Barry built the first one of these at a company founded. He spun it out of Parexel. It's called Sparkle City. In recent years, there's many graph vendors out there, a couple of which are kind of GoLab capable. And so I would contrast GoLab with I guess, well, no one's ever said it, but GoLTP, which is where most graph databases have their design point. So transaction processing systems are ones that capture data usually through point of sale or it's what's behind a website. It's essentially small transactions, lots of users, very fast, touching a couple of records, insert, update, delete, and so on. That's transaction processing, TP. And OLTP systems are where is the sort of architectural design point for most graph systems. And it certainly was, when I was getting into graph, and I was building middleware and tools and so on, we were using mainly other people's graph databases, and they were all very quick to update an individual instance in a class or to find an instance in class because they had indexes every which way. What they were very poor at were multi-hop joins where you touched enormous amounts of data, the equivalent of entire table scans in a relational database. And there's a very different design point for that. And in the case of Barry's system, it's basically an MPP system. So it's a nothing shared architecture, very similar to things like Netezza and Redshift and Snowflake and Teradata and so on. These are big MPP systems where you cluster your software and nothing is shared. There's sort of, cluster your data and nothing is shared, and the query is run in parallel across this cluster, and the results are aggregated and returned. None of the graph databases did that prior to Barry doing it. And so when he built that system, we now have a system that is capable of doing warehouse style operations. And what are warehouse style operations? Well, they're often transformational queries. So I talked about it briefly. I mentioned Informatica as a they have pipelines for populating relational data, moving data from one place to another. They mainly do ETL, extract, transform, and then load. So you extract the data, you transform it in the pipeline, and then you load it into your system. But prior to Informatica, and at least and still enormously popular in relational, is ELT, where you extract the data, you load it into the database, and then you use SQL, generally PL SQL if you're using Oracle. And that was a very, very popular system, using PL SQL to write transformations. So you're transforming the data in the database. Graph technology was too slow. The TP systems, the transactional systems, were just too slow to do those transformations. They were also very slow to load data. And then, of course, the other kind of thing you want to do in a data warehouse is analytic queries, where you ask these questions about not one person, but an entire population. Don't show me this particular sale that happened yesterday, this transaction, but show me all the transactions over all my stores over the last 12 months. That's the kind of thing you ask a warehouse that you don't ask a transaction-oriented system. And so Graph was missing this. And after Barry started Sparkle City and built that first system, it no longer was missing it, and now we are able to do this, essentially that kind of processing and ask those kind of questions, which is and in particular the data integration element. So people have had in their heads Graph in a kind of a box, a niche where, well, if the data is lots of relationships, it's highly connected, and we want to run these particular algorithms that you can only do if the data is arranged in a Graph database. That was where people had Graph for the longest time. Once you got to GoLab, suddenly you're able to address much broader sort of set of questions, because you're now dealing with much more data. At this point, we have not got to the end of how big the systems can be built. No customer has actually taken us to the point where we have to say, hey, we can't scale beyond this. It's simply a question of adding, an MPP system, adding more processing in parallel to address the problem. And so now we've got, if you like, graph has now got this other dimension to it that it's been missing. And I think but I'm not sure how widely that is appreciated yet. I think people don't know that GoLab is a thing. It's viable, and it's able to take on not just regular warehousing style loads, but obviously graph oriented loads. So lots of unstructured data, which we're told is something like 80% of the data within an enterprise, the textual data, presentations, emails, regulatory documents, product manuals, but all that stuff that every enterprise has got tons of, actually is far more voluminous in terms of size of data than the tabular structured data. I'll be very general here, but that data has been ignored up to now. But now that there's a way, maybe not ignored, maybe the people have had, sort of brute force search engines and things to try and help you find things within those corpuses. But actually using that data as part of an analytic has not really been possible. GoLab makes that possible, because you can address very large volumes of data in a coherent way and combine it with the structured data. And essentially what you're doing is you're essentially mining unstructured sources, structuring the data in the graph, but in a way that is richer and truer than you can do with sort of tabular oriented relational approaches to capturing the same data. And now you can query across both of them. And the transformation queries that you can do in graph are how you knit the graph together, you can use it for the same thing you'd use PL SQL for cleaning data and for rearranging it in ways that are comfortable to get to your data product that some users are going to access. Same thing with graph, only on multiple dimensions. Tables are kind of single dimension, single entity usually, whereas with graphs you're dealing with potentially thousands of entity types, and you need this similar way to knit them together, which you can now do with ELT queries in graph. So it's a huge, I think, a step function up. PL SQL and ELT has been very popular for many decades. I don't think people realize that you can do the same thing with graph, and it's just a much easier way of integrating data than anything we've had before. I will say what's been misleading, of course, is the transaction-oriented graphs have generally had to have external pipelines for preparing data. So you kind of have to figure out what the graph's going to look like, and then you pull data into it. So often you'll create a schema in the graph, kind of like you do with a relational database. You create the equivalent of a table. You're going to create a node description. That is less flexible than a schemaless GoLab system that can essentially arrange itself around the data as the data is loaded.
Yeah, exactly. You're no longer tied to 2 dimensions, right? You can flexibly extend your schema at any point in time, which also brings some organizational changes, right? Because IT departments have to transform, so you do not longer need dozens of people handling or maintaining the schema of the databases, right? So, I guess the question is, what's waiting on the other side? Like, what things have to change within an enterprise when you?
That's an interesting question, Boris, because I think it's out there still. So we're kind of somewhat speculating on it. One of the things that graph technology enables is this ability to create a de-siloed view of data across a lot of silos. But often those silos are owned by people and fiefdoms, and or there's regulations that keep in the financial services industry, the people who sell things are not allowed and trade are not necessarily allowed to be involved in the advisory business that is helping a company go public. So there's regulatory reasons and there's technical reasons why things are siloed within enterprises. De-siloing that data is often a social problem as much as a technical problem. people, they own the data, they own the people who maintain that data, and that's a little fiefdom. And it's so there's a whole lot of social stuff that I think will have to get worked out in individual businesses as they try to figure out how to unlock the sort of combined value of data. But that's one big change, is that it really now is viable to start building these views across data that is owned by lots of different people. And that's going to take some changed minds. It's going to need some people to change their minds. And that's probably going to come more from the top, I would think, than from the bottom. Another one is simply starting to think graph first about your data, knowledge graph first. How do we describe our data in a way that we want to, once you start to build a knowledge graph for an enterprise, how do you change the culture of all the different people who are currently creating databases? And you can imagine everywhere out there, businesses have thousands and thousands of access databases and spreadsheets, and then there's all the formal systems run by IT, etc. There's a shadow organization that is generating a lot of data, as well as the formal organizations. All that unstructured data is being generated, often by individuals within the business, as well as formal things around product catalogs or and so on, the website. How do you get people to start to think about, they've been doing whatever they've been doing with the tools that they know, but really what we want to do is get the data into the graph. It's because the data, one of my feelings on this whole thing about the knowledge graph is that it has an inherent value in terms of a network effect. For the web, when we got our first web server, and then you got a bunch of people with their browsers, and then the second web server came up and was online, and then more people with their browsers, and same with the telephone system or the fax system. The more people involved, the more servers involved providing data, the more people who are on the network who could answer the phone or get a fax, the more valuable that network became, until they became sort of ubiquitous. Well, the technology is now there to actually do that for data within a business, right? But how do you start to arrange things within your business that all data that is generated finds its way onto this graph, so onto these sort of big logical enterprise level knowledge graphs? Because clearly it's going to be more valuable connected up to everything else, with whatever constraints you need around legal stuff and privacy and so on, of course. But the technology is there to police that kind of thing. So the question really is, how does an organization become graph first, where all the data, not just the historical data, which is where we currently really are, which is de-siloing historical data, but any new data that's being generated by applications, how do you get your developers to start thinking graph first? So that's another big change that I think we're going to be requiring. If you get down into the weeds of, schemas versus ontologies, I think the people who people who build ER diagrams and schemas are going to be just as comfortable with models. They're just an abstraction away from where they are now. And in fact, in some ways, the task gets a bit easier, but it also gets bigger because you're able to address more data. So wider, I guess, but the technologies, the people who have an aptitude for dealing with relational schema and warehouses and ETL, all of that stuff applies, just in a new frame. So I don't think there's anything for them to be worried about. In fact, if anything, their jobs are going to get a bit easier, but also perhaps a little bit more, if you're able to deliver, those guys are under terrible pressure, right, to deliver to the business all the time. And it's deadline after deadline after deadline. And it's, as I said earlier, it's painstaking stuff. If you're able to deliver more quickly, you've got happier business users, more solutions. You may end up with a more fulfilling work experience, actually using technologies that are really delivering things that people appreciate, and more quickly and in a more agile fashion. So I'm not so worried about those people, but there's going to have to be a mind shift. They've got to learn about these technologies and figure out what the similarities are to the things they do already, and what the differences are, and adjusting around that. But I honestly don't think that's going to be a big shift for that kind of people of that kind of temperament and skill level. I think it'll be pretty straightforward. That's what we've always found ourselves. When people come and join us, they generally are able to adapt very quickly even if they've had no knowledge graph experience. So I'd say that the main differences are changing the way people think about their data, and changing the way the organization thinks about data as being more valuable when it's connected than when it's disconnected, and then breaking up the silos that kind of are protecting the data in ways that are not conducive to the general, the best value to the business. And those changes, I think, are the ones that will take longer, but are what you really need to do to get true value. And maybe as people are building newer businesses and they start to think graph first from the beginning, they get this. Let me give you an example actually of that. If I build an application on Amazon Neptune, for example, right, great graph store delivered by Amazon, and I used RDF and Sparkle, and I'm essentially building an app that is capturing data. It's doing transactions or whatever it is. That's more of a TP system than an OLAP system. Previously, to get data out of an application system like that, I'd have to do some kind of ETL to then put it into, say, into some kind of warehouse. So maybe the example I used wasn't as good as, maybe I'm using Aurora or one of the Elastic databases, and I've built an app that is capturing data. I then want to put that into Redshift to do analytics on it. I've got to essentially do an ETL process where I've got to figure out what the schema in Redshift is going to be, and I'm going to reconstitute that to do my reporting in Redshift. And so that's kind of the traditional way, and it's quite painful. Go to Amazon Neptune, on the other hand, I essentially build a graph-oriented application. I'm reading and writing the data in RDF. I'm using Sparkle to query it. That data, to do analytics on it, only has to be moved to another, GoLab RDF capable store. No ETL required to do the analytics, right? You just move the data. There's no transformation required. You can just use the data as is. So what does it get to get people thinking, hey, I should build my application on top of Neptune instead of building it on top of, MySQL? And the reason being that the data that I've created using that has become much easier. Now, there are other advantages around, the model being something that's easy to share with the business, so that both the developers and the people who specify the system have a shared understanding of what all the data means. These are side benefits of using open data standards. But there's this huge one, which is, hey, if I'm thinking graph first in terms of building new applications, then that data is immediately usable elsewhere in the graph. And by the way, also, if I store it using these open data standards, it means that the data is independent of the application in which it originated. It's self-describing. The model travels with the data and is sometime down the road the model can be introspected from the data which it's traveling with to be able to use it. So it's essentially future-proofing data as opposed to building a whole lot of MySQL tables or SQL Server tables and so on. Anyway, so and I'm sure we could go on and pick up many different pieces to this, but I think those for me are the biggest things, and that are going to have to change for this technology to really see its full promise.
Yeah, and I really like you mentioning this network effect, because I feel like graph technology is the only way to reach some kind of collective intelligence within an enterprise. And so are we heading towards a new era in handling the data? So how big of a change is that, or is it a gradual change that has been happening for the past decades?
I think what you just said at the start of that really resonates. For me, when we got into this, and this is when I was at IBM, we're talking 1999, 2000, something like that. We started looking at this technology, and at the time, I was trying to integrate a whole lot of desktop applets, I guess is the best way I could think of it. And we wanted them to talk to each other. One of them was a sort of an instant messaging tool, and another one was an LDAP-based tool, and another one was, I can't remember, maybe expenses, but it was a set of productivity apps. but they were decoupled. And what we wanted was to exchange data between them, but we kept on building new apps. And so what we wanted was a neutral way to exchange data between them. And we're trying to use XML schema as a description, to essentially for the packets that we had a messaging system that all these apps could tap into on the desktop and send each other messages. It was pretty clear that XML schema were too brittle and not, and if a new version of an app came out that had a slightly different schema, everything else would get broken. So we were looking for something else. And at the time, someone who was working for me went off to the AI lab at MIT to finish his PhD, and that's right next door to where the W3C is, CSAIL. And he came back, and so I guess there was some cross-pollination. He came back, hey, have you heard about this thing called RDF? And we hadn't, and we looked at it and we thought, wow, this is quite amazing. It will allow systems that are developed independently to start to exchange data in a meaningful way without being tied up to these rigid schema things and without needing schema conversions. And for me, it kind of, lit up there, because what I realized is that there was no other way we were going to get to without some kind of sufficiently advanced artificial intelligence. And I don't really mean the machine learning stuff that we're doing now, but something that can think a bit like us to try and make sense of all of these sort of formats and dialects and sources and nuance and context and all the stuff that you need to actually understand how to integrate data. Short of that, there was no other way forward except for these standards being used and applied. And of course, then the logical step was, well, how do we apply the standard? Let's go and start a company to apply those standards in a broad scale across every piece of the system that needs them. And that's kind of how I ended up talking to you today. But for me, there was just no other way forward without something that was like us, to essentially enable integration and much more quick methods of tying together data. So it hasn't been short, it's been very long. I mean, we've been working on this, me and my friends have been working on this, and many other people around the world, for more than 20 years. And but we're getting somewhere, right? And we've managed to assemble very large systems in different places, different companies, that are actually starting to deliver this. And I think what it really ends up happening is this long sort of lead up where nothing happens for a long time. It happens in a very small scale. There's a lot of setbacks, because we learned an awful lot. Getting to that scale that we have now was not, and continues to not be, that easy. But it until you get certain threshold things conquered, then there just isn't a way forward, right? Until we had the ETL tools working properly, it was a real pain to use our database, right? Because you just couldn't get data into it. Then we created ETL tools that I think are going to be world beaters, because they don't require, that can be done automatically, actually, right? So freeing somebody up to do something else. So once you tackle these individual problems, eventually the cumulative mass of them starts to allow the easier adoption across the board. And so, so I expect the adoption to continue to increase as we've seen it, and it continued to accelerate in terms of the numbers of people involved as the automation improves, as we can apply machine learning and all the modern stuff that's coming along the way that can help us. As you apply that, I think we can start to see it be used much on a much broader scale. The last couple of years has seen much bigger interest in knowledge graph than ever before. When we're talking, I think this is an anecdotal measure, but I think we had more POCs in the last quarter than we've ever had before in one. It's almost like a whole year's worth in one quarter kind of thing. And so that's showing that there's a lot more interest, but I think that interest is not only because it's being written about in the press and the tools are getting better and so on, but people are looking at their business problems and saying, well, is there a technology out here that can, that's viable and practical and not too expensive that I get to deliver this. And as we continue to our own plans to make the software more packaged and more automatic, it just makes it easier and easier for people to adopt. I mean, look at a technology like the iPhone, right? Very simple for people to use, ubiquitous interface. And if you think about all its antecedents, all the different things that we had Blackberries before that, we had the Windows phones, and each one sort of incrementally added on until you get to a point where suddenly this thing's mass market. Now, mass market for data integration and generation of data products, it's a smaller market than iPhone, but it's the same, I think the same rules. It's a question of maturing the technology or making more automatic, picking the problems that you're going to solve and solving them really, really well. All of those contribute to something which is a world changer. iPhone, I think, was a world changer. And I think we're looking at a similar, although more modest, it may touch a lot of people who will use the data that is generated all over the place, but the actual people who integrate data are probably a relatively small community. But in every business, they're vital. For them, it's going to be a huge, huge change. But how long it takes for that to trickle into businesses, one POC, one production at a time, until you start to get the critical mass, it's very difficult to estimate. But often these things take off very suddenly, and you're never quite sure what think about voice over IP. We used it in varying forms, and then suddenly Skype was there in a packaging that could, I think the critical thing they solved too was the quality of the voice and the fact that this client could traverse firewalls automatically. And suddenly the thing took off. They solved those two little things that held the technology to a much smaller audience. They solved those, and suddenly we weren't paying for phone calls anymore, right? It happened very quickly when finally two blockers were removed. And so it will be interesting to see what that it ends up being with knowledge graph technology.
Yeah. So, Sean, what do you think? Because knowledge graphs are conquering one industry after another, right? So we have social networks, search engines, natural language understanding, master data management, right? So all these classical things. Do you think that they will soon be also very present in other applications, for example, for IoT or self-driving cars to connect all the different devices?
Well, short answer is yes. So there's a great quote by William Gibson, the guy who wrote the cyberpunk fiction. I can't remember the classic one, but off the top of my head, it'll come to me in a minute. But his quote, at least, was, the future is already here, but it's just not evenly distributed. Well, I'm paraphrasing it probably. It's probably not exactly that, but it's essentially that. And as you say, we've been seeing knowledge graphs for a long time before they were even called knowledge graphs. I think the term knowledge graph came from Google and the great Google graph, which was really a graph that was going to provide context to your search results. And different companies have used graph in different ways. I mean, LinkedIn and Facebook, they are a graph. I mean, they're a social graph, right? So we saw glimpses of the future and future use cases there, but of course, this technology is, as it matures, is going to become increasingly used as just being a far more flexible way of managing data, whether that be data resting in databases or just on disks waiting to be found, or whether it be data in flight through IoT systems or great big REST deployments. All of those things are starting to happen. They just happen a little bit at a time as people sort of you need various shakeouts of there are many graph engines out there, and they talk a whole lot of different dialects. Until people start adopting one, that's one of the things that gets in the way. right? There is an effort now. The Sparkle is a standard from the W3C that's been with us a long time. There's a new effort to create an ANSI standard called GQL, Graph Query Language. That will be another one of these things that vendors will probably have to adopt that or be excluded from selection because people don't want to buy into proprietary skills as the market kind of shakes down. There'll be less vendors. All of these things are kind of simplifying events and will spur adoption more widely. It'll become graph first will become the way. As I said a little earlier to an earlier question, or answer rather, part of an answer to an earlier question, I don't see any other way you can do the kinds of things people want to do at scale in any practical way without essentially using graphs or whatever follows graphs. And I think we're a long way from thinking about what follows graphs at this point. We've still got to go through the whole graph thing. But will you see it ubiquitously? Yes, absolutely you will. Many cases it'll be invisible, it'll be in your phone apps, it'll be in the systems you're interacting with on the web and the apps on your phone and so on. All of that is absolutely going to happen because there really isn't any other way to do this that is cheap enough now that this starts to prove itself out. It just head and shoulders will rise above simply because it is more practical and cheaper. There may be certain twists needed in terms of more middleware for developers, for example. But, you know, a whole generation of people were taught about graph in the EU over the last 20 years. And I think a lot of them have been waiting for graph software to become practical enough to apply in their business. And that is just starting to happen in the last 2 or 3 years. So now suddenly we're getting an influx of people in Germany and France and Spain who know about these technologies, know about the standards, but may have failed 10 years ago because something wasn't scalable enough or wasn't mature enough. But now they're saying, hey, you guys are there with something that we can actually use. They're starting to really kick the tires and try and see if they can apply it to very difficult business problems in all of those areas that you mentioned earlier. And there'll be some failure and there'll be some enormous successes too. And that's how we progress. So and once you get a momentum about this thing, it really can snowball very quickly into something very big. And I think we're definitely starting to see that. Look at the valuations. If you're looking at early indicators, look at the valuations on some of the people who've started graph companies in the last few years, and what the VCs are now putting in terms of money. You know, some people really do think this is going to work, and they're putting their money where their mouths are.
Sean, last question. What do you think, how far away are we from not using knowledge graphs being a huge competitive disadvantage, where knowledge graphs are a standard in enterprise landscapes?
I honestly don't know, and I'm probably not the right person to ask that because I'm always optimistic, too optimistic. Things always take, I can see where it's going to go, but I have no idea how long it's going to take, and except that it'll take longer than even my most sort of pessimistic view of it. But I will say we're starting to now see successful production deployments of knowledge graphs at significant scales in terms of the volumes of data, doing well and doing what we wanted them to do. And that's the start of it. How long it's going to take before, who knows? I mean, the mainframes are still with us, right? And they're not really going away either. Here's the thing: when somebody gets something, it's painful to get some system working. It takes a lot of effort, and there's a lot of trial and error and a lot of expense. People are very reluctant once they've got something working to throw it out in favor of something else. It's high risk. So I think it'll take a good while before you see graphs really replacing everything. But do I think you'll see them quite soon building these data fabrics? I think absolutely. I think that's starting to happen. Enterprises take 2 or 3 years to kind of really wind themselves up. they started looking at this 2 or 3 years ago in earnest. We're talking now not the sort of the R&D sort of skunkworky groups. We're talking about the mainstream sort of IT architects and so on. I've been looking at this technology now for a few years, and by looking at it, I mean investing in it, running POCs, putting systems into production, pushing back on features that they think they need that to run in, that they expect from an enterprise point of view, single sign-on and Kerberos authentication and all the things that kind of get left to the end. All of those are now have been demanded and are being put in. So I think we're going to start seeing increasing amounts, but I think you'll see it in particular areas. I think data fabric is a very good one, but there's many domains that are specific. If you look at any of the graph companies' websites, you can read the use cases, what the customers are doing with them, and so those are where you get essentially where people get their feet wet with graph. But once you've succeeded with something, as I say, nothing succeeds like success. So if you manage to do something, generally at this point, you're not going to use graph until you've succeeded with it in some way. It's the early adopters who are getting into this. But once those early adopters have proved the way, you'll have the normal adoption where there's sort of a much bigger part of the population who might buy the products will start to want to take the same kind of benefit. So I think we're going to just work our way through the normal adoption curve as for any technology. It's been a long time coming. I don't think people realize quite how much had to be done to make this work. And from my point of view, it's been an entire rewrite of the entire compute stack from top to bottom. We've had to do every single piece of this. And the issue, of course, is that if you don't have every single piece, you can't practically deliver a solution because it's just there's big gaps that have to be filled with some kind of integration. And it just makes it too expensive, too risky. Once you've got all those pieces assembled, suddenly it becomes something that an early adopter can think about taking on. An early adopter that's not a kind of a researcher, but someone who actually has a business to run and a business problem to address. So it's going to take a while, but I think you'll see ever increasing amounts of it. From my perspective, this is obviously biased because I've invested an awful lot of my time making this, working on this, but it seems to us like a much better approach in general. It solves so many of the problems that plagued sort of practical issues that plagued the earlier technologies. In particular, that metadata and data can be combined, and that you can deal with really any level of complexity of data, lots of relationships, huge heterogeneity of the types of things you want to tie together. Nothing else comes close. And so people who are trying to unlock the value of data will recognize that and say, okay, it's time for me to get my feet wet. And that's been happening now for on an accelerating basis for the last year or two. Even with COVID, things didn't stop. They slowed down a little bit, but they've come roaring back after the first 3 or 4 months of COVID, while the world was kind of trying to figure out what was going on. But after that, things really picked up again. So anyway, inevitable, but I'm the wrong guy to guess the time frame. It's taken me much longer, at least 10 years longer than I thought.